Welcome, guys, to METALLERIUM Pages. It's a great pleasure to talk with you about Thaetas, I think is the correct pronunciation, Thaetas, and this new album, The Irredeemable Age, and more things related to the metal world in general. So we started by asking, how are you doing today? How is the band in the last 6 years? Because your tremendous first album was released in 2020.
Yeah, no, well, first off, we're doing good and thanks for having us. A lot's been going on the last 6 years, of course, with COVID, that universal experience for everybody, but we kept writing slowly and consistently, kind of refining the songs over time. Recorded like I think 2 years ago at some point, and then slowly pieced everything together. And that's kind of how we usually roll, kind of on our own pace sometimes.
Hmm.
That's for sure. Yeah, 6 years. That's a good time period. Feels like a lot's happened, But yeah, doing good. We're a kind of slow and steady kind of outfit.
Hmm.
Yeah, I just
Okay.
want to note too, with the 6 year thing, it so happens that the album's going to come out exactly on the 6 year
Yeah.
anniversary of the first release. So kind of all worked out in a sense.
Oh, okay, okay, I understand, I understand. So now, well, one of the bigger changes for this album is that you initially was with Magus Stump, the first label, the first record. Now you change with the Profound Love Records with Chris. So how was this change happen? Who approached who to release this new album? And what kind of opinion do you have compared with the previous record and now with this new record?
I guess I could just start off with the profound lore part. Um, Around when we first dropped the first record and did the mastering through Colin, we kind of heard through the grapevine that Chris was a fan of the first album, and I think that he probably would have been interested in putting it out, but we didn't necessarily have that direct contact.
Mhm.
That relationship developed over the years, and also my other band, Reeking Aura, we happened to also be on Profound Lore, so there was the joint connection there to kind of work with both bands. And
Yeah, I
Pat, you want
think
to talk
Colin
about the
actually
yep.
made the connection directly, you know. So Colin, the producer, I believe he's worked with Profound Lore in the past. I can't remember on what record, but yeah, he was the guy who introduced.
Hmm. Okay, so tracks like The End of History and Summers of Hate hint at deeply pessimistic socio-political themes. Extreme metal often defaults of the sci-fi gore or fantasy or bi-lyrical approach focused heavily on real-world existential panic, systematic breakdown, and psychological claustrophobia. I mean, there's a lot of things, especially for the metal, for extreme music. So now, so when you look at the title, The Irremediable Age, do you view the record as a passive reflection of a dying society, or is it the music intentionally designed to provoke an active, uncomfortable sense of panic in the listeners?
That's a great question. I mean, you know, there's a ton of great bands that have fantastical lyrics,
Mhm.
but you know, we didn't want to do the same thing that we've seen a million times, I think, we feel like we have some somewhat unique music and wanted to capture the atmosphere of the environment that we're in, have something to say about the modern era, but uh, not also directly on the nose either, right? Like, we do it in a way that's slightly off. It's slightly surreal. It's not direct. We don't have lyrics about particular political figures or, you know, um, public figures of any sort, because I think that becomes dated in a really short period of time. And I think it's interesting to kind of muse on some of the subjects that are basically eternal. You can say probably the same thing about a politician now that you could 100 years ago. And I think that's a little more interesting than, who's causing problems right now.
Mm. Okay, okay. Now, the local New York heritage of suffocation and internal bleeding relies on massive, heavy grooving momentum, but yet Taitas frequently interrupts those satisfying slams with angular chords and unsettling jazzy note progression, and some more like in aspects for like dissonant sound, like Gorgus Obscura era from Gorgus. So, and also for both, how do you prevent these two contrasting ideas, uncompromising the straight to the chest New York brutality and hyper abstract technical dissonance, from fighting each other with the structure of brief, intense 3 minute songs like, for example, the song Dukkha?
Yeah. Um, I do think some of it is natural and it's not necessarily a conscious decision. We kind of happen to like both bands from the side of the spectrum, whether it's the groovy New York bands like you mentioned, or also more like the more dissonant bands like Gorguts, etc. But then, there's also the slew of New York bands that are kind of in between, like Morpheus Descends and Malignancy and even Immolation, where you're kind of combining a little bit of dissonant sounds, not straightforward hardcore groove, but still a sense of rhythm, especially with a band like Immolation, right? You would never say Immolation is playing slams, but they're undeniably groovy along with kind of chaotic riffs. So that's kind of what we go for just with what we like. Um, but I don't think it's too conscious of a decision. It kind of just like it's out as we play.
Mm.
Yeah, I think, the one element that was conscious when we started the band is that we like a lot of things that feel like they go together. And, while I'm not going to say that they've never been done before, but, um, it was a pretty good video by the metal music theory guy Calder recently talking about dissonant death metal and how the moniker is a little unnecessary, right? Like if you put on a Cannibal Corpse song, it's dissonant. The notes just don't hang over themselves in a way that dissonant death metal is usually perceived as. So the musical elements really go together very easily. I don't think they contrast very much. I think we just tried to have to feel out how to do it in a way that's not like a paint by numbers thing. Here's this section and then this section, and you can recognize which band we're ripping off on one part versus the next. We try to just mix those in a way where it represents the stuff we like and where we come from, but hopefully put it in a blender in a way that hasn't quite been done exactly before.
Okay, okay. So modern technical death metal has arguably developed a massive production issue. It often sounds utterly artificial, with heavily triggered drums, perfectly grid-aligned guitars, and stereo lack of dynamic range. By the contrast, so tracking by the main song of the album, independently has preserved a raw human element in this record. So now, when you were tracking your performance for these new songs, how consciously did you work to keep the rim section sounding volatile and human at the same time, rather than letting it fall to the clean machine-like craft of the standard modern tech death?
Yeah, I think a lot of it comes of with our usual practices with recording, which is never really playing or recording to a metronome. Everything we do is just from us jamming together, and we kind of develop feels and tempos from playing together. And same with the recording process. So, um, you know, typically you're going to record drums first, but we're still recording songs as, full songs with guitars and everything, and then kind of layering on top of that instead of going grid by grid. What's cool though is we've noticed that Criffo, our drummer, he's like surprisingly really steady without playing a metronome, where you can go back into the recording and hear like, oh wow, that section is like the exact same speed as it was before without consciously doing it. Um, and we agree. We all agree that we don't like the hyper polished kind of sound where metal's going, even though it's kind of fun from a musical engineering standpoint. It kind of takes away some of the soul and feel of the music. And that's kind of what we were going for when we chose Colin to work on this record with us.
Yeah, Colin, I mean, he is known for not brickwalling his masters. Um, it's very organic sounding and natural. So we want to go with that. And yeah, just the songs we come up with. A good amount of the material is written in a room. It's not one or even two people coming in with full songs and saying, "Hey, this is what we're going to play, we develop it together. So there's kind of a looseness to some of the stuff, even the technical stuff. It's not um, over composed in a way. So we want to preserve that field and basically record it the same way that we play in a room. Wanted it to sound kind of like a live band.
Hmm. Okay, okay. Now compare the bold cover art for the previous album for this 2020 with it was done by Polo Girardi, and now with one of the biggers into the extreme metal, especially from the brutal death metal, is John Sick. So how can you englobe all the sounds and perspective that this new album, and why you select John Sick instead to continue with Paolo Girardi? Because Paolo Girardi is more sort of like Divina Commedia books. He has this kind of point of view in all the cover arts. But John Sick is more visceral, more brutal. So what do you decide to change now for this record with John Sick?
Uh, what's interesting is I think there's a lot of parallels between the art and the music.
Mhm.
When we went with Polo, like you said, he has that side that style, that Divine Comedy, really dark style. And the art that we went with him kind of focuses on buildings and like infrastructure in a decaying city, which is a little contrasting to what he normally does. And that's kind of like the effect of the music that we go for. There's a familiar name, a familiar sound, but we're kind of doing our own thing. And same with John Zig, as you mentioned, he's known for his brutal, more gory kind of works, and we love all John Zig's works. And then we went with another similar theme that we went with Polo. So going with something recognizable, but also different at the same time.
Yeah, I think we talked about the first cover being it's not quite New York City, right? It's a little off. Like there's classical ruins kind of mixed in, and
Correct.
the title of the record, right, is Shrines to Absurdity, and I guess that theme is, that we as a species have always kind of worshipped some sort of insanity. We don't really make sense. We do ridiculous things, and that's continuous from 1,000 years ago, where you have the ruins in the foreground, to the modern city and into the future and whatever, and it'll always be that way as long as we're around, I think. So, the idea of the classical ruins came in, and Paulo Girardi's from Italy. He's
Mhm,
familiar with all of the reference concepts that I came up
mhm,
with, and one specific artist that he mentioned was Piranesi. He has
mhm,
these famous prison etchings, which they're very architectural based. It's kind of 19th century architectural drawings, but none of them make sense. They're surreal. And, I think movies like Labyrinth and stuff like that kind of take his style and make it into a movie or whatever. So, he took that influence and he got the idea, the surreal kind of mashup that we were thinking about. With this one, I don't know, like I think John Zig almost has kind of like a monochrome color scheme to a lot of things, like quasi monochrome, not monochrome, but almost, very one or two colors, and I don't know, it's just really brutal. Like at least I wanted something really oppressive looking, just really brutal. So I don't know, no one can do that more like him, and it was kind of cool to work with someone who's like he's done Disgorge, he's done Defeated Sanity, a lot of bands that we really look up to. So it was
mhm.
nice to be able to get a cover from, someone who's been around a long time on a lot of our favorite records.
Okay, so now many modern technical death metal bands feel they need to blow out their albums into 50 or 60 minutes marathons with a lot of technicality, with a lot of staff, great musician, etc., etc. So which often results if the listener fatigue due to the sheets or density of the notes because there is too much notes to analyze sometimes for these kind of bands. So now the irremediable age clocks in a lint, punishing and hyper efficient 30 minutes. So, and the question is, so why was trimming the fat a conscious decision to maximize the psychological impact of the album? And how did you determine it when a track had achieved its maximum level of structural violence without overstaying its welcome?
We mostly ended the songs basically where it felt like they should end, you know? So, um, if a song was really short and it just felt like, well, like I think Summers of Hate is probably like 2.5 minutes or something like that. It's over. It's just there's nothing more to add. We could have tacked on more and more pieces, but it's like when a TV show is successful and they have five more seasons. It's just I don't know. Does it do anything musically? Does it add anything? I don't really think so. So, I don't know. Whereas the last song ended up being really long for us, and that was also not planned. That was I started writing that song with the intention that that would be the opener, a 1.5 minute song, and it just kept going. Like I don't know, I didn't feel totally in control of it. It just kept getting longer. So, I don't know. We just kind of let them get as long or short as possible. And yeah, I guess we could have just kept writing more and more songs, but as someone who listens to a lot of this kind of music, when you get over 10 plus songs of very dense music. Yeah, like you said, it's listener fatigue.
Mm.
I don't know. I'd rather it just, you know, yeah, enough is enough kind of thing. I'd rather leave people wanting more than be like, wow, I'm sick of this. It started off good, but now I'm not gonna finish the record. That's what we didn't want. So that's what we went for.
Mm. Okay, okay. So in a traditional brutal death metal, the bass guitar is unfortunately often relegated to simply mirroring of the rhythm guitar or getting buried entirely in the loud and mid. On this new record, the bass lines are incredibly active, dissonant, and independent, acting as a third melodic voice that actively destabilizes the songs. So when you compose your when the bass are composing along with the guitar rights or the chaotic guitar work, how do you find the geometric space to inject your own technical counterpoints without collapsing the actual rhyme of the song?
I would say since the songs kind of just build off of each other, um, we end up writing our own parts together, and through jamming, we kind of hear what works, what doesn't in the room. But sometimes it's not even that strictly written. And just to comment on the bass lines, like you mentioned, Corey is an incredibly creative and talented bass player, multi-instrumentalist. And hearing the reamping of the bass, we heard so many added parts and so many grooves and so many parts that like were really prominent. Um, and he did an awesome job. And what's cool too is in our first record, I would say we had some prominent bass with a different bass player, Jimmy, and he had his own style, finger style that would still stuck out. But Corey was able to add his own imprint, and we still had that prominent bass, and but it's now with Corey's voicing.
Yeah, it's interesting. This was Corey's first record playing bass with us, and I mean, he always was the vocalist, but he picked up bass this time as well. And I don't know, like Terrell mentioned, he's a multi-instrumentalist. He has a lot of different projects where he, programs drums, plays guitar, does vocals, does bass. So, even parts where there isn't a flashy bass line, it's very well composed. He kind of knows how to look at a song in total and add something to it. And we also, the way we write stuff is, everyone in the band, I think, is really good at what they do. And, even if I write a section, I don't come in and say, hey, you have to play this and you have to play that. Like everyone comes up with their own parts for that section. And it just kind of evolves in a crazy, spontaneous kind of a way.
Okay, okay. Now we're talking about a little more for the promotion of this new record. So, what kind of promotion do you have for this new one? Perhaps you will embark some tours, present more videos, or perhaps you're already working on a third album. Who knows? Because 6 years preparing for everything, preparing just perhaps Son is like in yes, is keeping for a new record. Who knows? Who knows? What kind of plans do you have for Thaetas and this new record?
So I'd say we're, going through the normal press cycle along with Dave with Ear Split.
Mhm.
He's handling a lot of our press releases and our PR. Also working through Chris and Profound Lord, our typical social medias, Facebook, Instagram, etc. Um, Obviously looking to play some good shows to get the new album out there, get it in front of people. We have some things planned, at least for a local show later in the summer. Um, but if anybody's hearing this, we're looking for some cool shows to play. Um, and I think that's always the best way. Thetas has always been like a almost like a word of mouth kind of band. We just played a lot in our local scene, developed a lot of relationships with our bands, and we've kind of just been around for a bit. So it'll be kind of cool continuing that grassroots approach. And now we're kind of now on a bigger platform. So it's gonna take a little more, pushing. And I got to get better with the social media stuff. But that's the day and age. That's how we do things.
Okay, okay. Now let's talk about another kind of, especially because one thing that captured my attention since the 90s, well, or the end of the 80s when I was there. I remember old bands like Cannibal Corpse starting in the state of New York, Mortician State on the New York. Obviously, then changed for a different state later. But use or well, also Pyrexia, Internal Bleeding, Suffocation, all these kind of bands started in New York. And for me, it's very curious because it's the New York death metal scene has undergone a massive generation shift. We have moved for the classic ladies for the 90s from 2000s era, and a new wave is redefining the New York brutality. Like we put Imperial Triumph, we put Piron, that kind of bands that redefine completely the look that we say that now is brutal. So right now in and this kind of bands are like incorporating more elements, strong noise, avant-garde, chaos, a lot of things. So as a band sitting right an intersection of the old school slam and modern forward thinking dissonance, how do you view your current role in an evolution of the local New York scene? Do you feel the more aligned with the traditionalist or the radical experimentalism that the state of New York has?
It's a very
I
good
would.
question.
Oh
Go
yeah,
ahead.
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I think we could both definitely add to this. Um, what's always cool is we can fit on every bill, but we're always going to be the odd man out on every bill. And a lot of our first shows we played with a lot more slam oriented, brutal bands, and we fit, but we also stood out because, like you said, we're trying to push, our music in a little different direction and not stay completely rooted in one sound. But we've also played with the more experimental side of the scene, from the New York scene, and that's the beauty of it. We kind of got exposed to and play through both scenes at the same time with places like bands and acts like Ava Mendoza, Krallis, Mark Edwards, etc. Um, so it's kind of cool we've been able to toe the line between both and not necessarily be the exact same. I do like that you mentioned Imperial Triumphant and Puron because they do represent what we will call our generation, the bands that we first started going to see shows and playing with, old bands like Humanity Falls, from the late 2000s and 2010s, flourishing. Piran was out there, Triumphant as well. So we kind of fit into that niche as well, where they're doing something heavy and a little artsy in a sense too. So yeah, let me. I won't talk too much about it. How about you, Pat?
Yeah, I think, you know, I really like both sides of it. So, we maybe take a little bit more from Suffocation, etc., than, maybe Piran does, but Piran, Krallis, all of those bands love brutal death metal. They just don't play it specifically. Those guys are on the same wavelength. So, you know, I don't know. I like brutal death metal too much to not play those types of riffs, but I also wanted to do something different with it. So I think we just kind of wanted to bridge the gap. But another thing is a suffocation in bands like that. There was nobody who sounded like that at that point. So, I think, taking that up in spirit is more doing something different with it than just trying to sound like suffocation. That
Mm.
that certainly wasn't their mentality back then. They were somehow listened to Slayer and came up with Human Waste. So, you know, they
Yeah.
were experimental too. And New York just has like such a rich tradition of experimental music and jazz and I don't know, chamber music and like everything's here. So it's hard to not just take a little bit of piece of everything and mash it together. Uh,
Mm. Okay, yeah, that is true. That is true. I remember when, for example, when I compare the 90s, or the first tapes, the FEG Forgotten, with the other tapes at that moment, I remember very clear. I hear Cannibal Corpse, The Aside, band's great, a lot of intensity, a lot. But when you hear Suffocation, there's a different kind of thing. At that moment, it was like, no, that's we need to take very serious this kind of music. It's not easy to digest. It's not easy to
yeah,
digest. Is
yeah, yeah,
you need to hear very completely. Well, in this
yeah, yeah.
topic, and we are very close to ending this interview. Also, obviously, New York has this very specific history legacy of weird, challenging extreme music. You said it started Suffocation, other bands inspired by the Finland masters, Demilich, and obviously there's new sound like Imperial Triumph or Piron, but also these kind of bands, the new bands or the avant-garde metal bands that are now appear like you are under the sound of the Colin Marston Studios. That's a curious thing because this one I spoke with him like 2 or 3 years ago, and each project that he touched is like a very weird project. I don't know, but he likes this kind of music. He likes that kind of music. So do you consider that Thaetas to be direct a continuation for the specific geographic New York lineage, or do you feel that your internet era influence makes the band sounds entirely stateless?
Interesting. I've been thinking about this a lot with other interviews. A lot of people ask about New York and stuff like that. And I don't think we're entirely stateless, whether nationally or even more locally, just because I think, it helps knowing that there's a local audience for whatever you do, even if it's completely insane. Like I don't know if that would be the case in some parts of the country, right? Or parts of the world for that matter. In New York, you can try something really weird and somebody's gonna like it. So you can still get on a show. You don't have, you're gonna have some fans, no matter what you do. So I think that does kind of help, and then as a result, it's easier to, build a network of other people who are open-minded, experiment with music and that kind of a thing. I mean, certainly with the internet, there's a lot of things that we never would have heard a long time ago. There's key bands for us that don't come from New York. Um, you know, Defeated Sanity is one with a big splash that everybody listens to. But, even going back to Cryptopsy and, some of the other big bands, of course, So, yeah, I guess that's my take on that.
Yeah, and I would say too, Colin is just like what Pat mentioned in the last question, that he's like firmly in both scenes. He loves brutal death metal as well. And he was one of those key people in the scene playing both genres with both his bands. So it seemed like since he was the producer, he understood the sound. So that was also the guy he went to. And then it kind of became its own sound between his productions and the bands that he participated in, and also the bands that he produced.
Mhm.
Um, and it's cool that he ended up going with bigger bands too, like Gore Guts, and even doing some of the Defeated Sanity records. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
well, guys, guys, we arrived at the sad moment of this interview. It was a tremendous pleasure to speak with both. Really, these new records are a massive brutality as usually as the first record because I love the first record. So now I just did my pre-order for the new record, so I hope arrives soon. I hope not delayed too much. So, and perhaps do you want to add something to your Latin American fans that expect someday a full Latin American tour? Who knows? And obviously, Metallerium followers.
Well, thanks for all the support from Latin America. Of course, we would love to play down there. Um, and we're just looking forward to everybody receiving the new album. It's very much us. It's a very, I hate to say personal record, but we lean more into our sound, and it's even more how can I say it? Just brutal. Our brutal.
Yeah, yeah, I think we weren't afraid to be a little idiosyncratic, you know. But yeah, thanks a lot, and those are really thoughtful questions. So it's great, great little chat. Thanks for
Great.
having us on.